Hi everyone, it's Chris Green, the History Chap, Friday afternoon, and it's our normal wander through British history, the events that happened in British history this week. Well, not this week, but this week in the past. So hello and greetings, as this is a live show. Greetings to, well, see, we've already got the gathering of the clans. Hello to Leslie over in South Carolina. Hello, Jen in Cumbria, a very warm Cumbria. Blimey, that's a change, isn't it? Fred Russell, hello in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts. Cincinnati, Terry, we've got the gathering of Americans here today. This is quite cool. Sarah Jane, lovely to see you as well. Bavaria, Peter, nice to have you as well. Sorry, let's just move my microphone across a little bit. QA Library, lovely to see you as usual. Thank you very much for all of your support. And Dalton as well, lovely to see you from Toronto in Canada. So, as I say, these hope you're all doing well, and it's been a busy week actually for the History Chap, but it's been a busy week in British history. So I'll tell you what. First off, let me just tell you what happened in British history this week. Top lines. Then I'll give you a little bit about what hell I've been up to, including my videos this week. And then I thought we would then touch on a few of the subjects in a little bit more detail. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. Normally, I do it from Sunday through to Friday or through to the Saturday. Okay, so by days. So it's a bit of a pick and mix. We could be 20th century, then the Anglo-Saxons, then the Tudors, then back somewhere else. But that's one alternative. That's how I normally do it. But I'll take a bit of a poll for you. Or I can do it by historical date. So we start at the very furthest point and we move up into the 20th century. I don't think I've got anything from the 21st century here. So anyone, have we got any takers? Is it day by day or chronological years? What would people prefer today? This is your moment to set the agenda for today. How are people feeling on that? Hello to everyone else who's coming in. Bangkok. As you do it now. Terry Murphy's also saying day by day. So let's go for day by day then. All right. Let me just put a little thing up here so I can see what did happen on the days, just so I'm not you don't want to see the top of my head too much, do you? Righty ho, let's kick off then. So the 28th of April, which is back on Sunday, okay? 28th of April, 1603, the funeral of Queen Elizabeth I. I'll come back to that in a little while if necessary, but the funeral of Queen Elizabeth I in London. She was buried at Westminster Abbey, and thousands attended her funeral. By now, the new king, James I of England, James VI of Scotland, was on the throne. But so there we go. 28th of April, again, 1923, the first FA Cup final at Wembley Stadium. It's called the White Horse Final. And hopefully we can drop into that and do a little bit more about that one a little bit later. Sort of an iconic moment in British sporting history, I guess. Where are we at? 29th of April, 1770. Captain James Cook sets foot on Australia. Beginning of the British involvement with Australia. So on the 28th of April, 1770. So we're only talking, 250 years ago. And it's amazing, isn't it? That is like a founding moment, a major moment in Australian history. And yet, of course, by British standards and, well, most of European standards, in fairness, that's just like a little pinprick, isn't it? In historical terms. The French Revolution was just about to happen then. So, and of course, even the Americans had 13 colonies by that stage. Let's just get some water here. 29th of April, 1916, the British garrison or the British army at the town of Kut in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, surrenders to the Ottoman Turks during the First World War. And I'll come back and do a little bit more about that one if you'd like me to in a moment, okay? So, but a major defeat for the British during the First World War in a theatre that most Brits don't really realise British troops were even fighting in Iraq in the 1910s in the First World War. Because as I said before, the Brits, we've got this absolute fascination with the Western Front and the mud and of Flanders and the poppies. I don't realise just how many British soldiers were serving in so many other theatres of war during the First World War. Keeping a little bit on a wartime thing, but into the Second World War, actually. On the 30th of April, 1943, the man who never was placed over the side of a British submarine off the coast of Spain. More famously, well, the film was The Man Who Never Was, black and white film. More recently, with Colin Firth, it's been transformed into the film Operation Mincemeat, which was the actual code of that particular operation. And this was it was a deception plot to try and get the Germans to take troops away from Sicily, southern end of Italy, and move them to the Aegean Sea in the eastern Mediterranean. And it was all basically the obvious thing. Rommel had been defeated in North Africa by the British under Montgomery and by the Americans from Operation Torch, and the obvious next step for the Allies was to go that reasonably short hop across the Mediterranean from Tunisia to Sicily. And that was the obvious one. So basically, Operation Mincemeat was to try and convince the Germans that whilst that was the obvious move, the British were going to try and do something far more cunning and go to the Aegean Sea over in Greece. And they needed to move some of their men over there. And it was an incredible storyline. If you can read the book, Operation Mincemeat by, I've forgotten his first name, but McIntyre, journalist, absolutely fantastic storyline. Basically, the whole thing, and if you've seen the film, you'll know either of the films, you'll know the sort of synopsis, although the book goes into a lot more detail. But basically, they had to convince the Germans that there was plans to invade or have an operation in the Aegean Sea, and they did this by floating a body ashore of a dead man who had a dead military officer who had plans for the invasion of the Aegean. And they knew that the Spanish authorities under Franco, fascist government, would pass those on, or certain members of the government would pass those on to the Germans. So it was all a massive deception plot. And anyway, we'll get into that. But they had this body. It was actually of a man who'd taken rat poison in England, committed suicide, a Welshman, Glyndwr Michael. And they had to obviously find someone who looked like they'd drowned. You couldn't just have someone from a car crash or who died of cancer or something. They had to have someone who looked like they'd actually drowned. There'd be water in their lungs. And incredible thing. And they used this body of this man, Glyndwr Michael, who they claimed was Captain William Martin. It was Ewan Montagu and Charles Cholmondeley were the two sort of members of the British Secret Service who organised this. They were reporting into Rear Admiral John Godfrey, and one of John Godfrey's assistants, Rear Admiral Godfrey's assistants, who was heavily involved in the plot, but not one of the key commanders of the plot, was a young naval officer called Lieutenant Commander Ian Fleming, who you might know better as the creator of James Bond. And if you read Operation Mincemeat, it's just amazing how no wonder he got some of his ideas for some of the early James Bond action novels. So there you go. Let me just say hello to a few folk who are popping in now. Terry Murphy, Gloriana. Yes, she was. We're talking Elizabeth I there. QA Library, thank you very much for the recommendation. I'm just going to read this out. Chris, a book to add to your collection. As if I haven't got enough to try and read. Broadway, a history of the New York City after the Declaration of Independence was read to the Continental Army in New York on July the 9th, 1776. Okay, interesting one. Fascinating bit of history there. Yep. Tim Murphy said, could I do a little bit more on the Mesopotamian front today? I could do a little bit more about the Siege of Kut in particular. So yeah, I'll come back to that one. Charlie, love to see you. Thank you very much for your support as a member here on YouTube. Thank you. QA Library, you're on a roll here now, talking about New York in the American Revolution. And of course, big date coming up, 2026, 250 years since the American Declaration of Independence and the start of the war. Ronald, good morning to you from Cincinnati, Ohio. Good afternoon from here in the old country. What about the Macedonian front? Macedonian front, or the Salonika front, as it's often referred to in Britain, I'm going to do as a separate video. Okay, so keep with me on that one. Stephen Adams says, good morning. No school today, so joining you live. It's great to have you here, Stephen. Right, so let me keep going with dates that happened this week in British history, top lines, okay? So 1st of May, hallelujah. This is one of those weeks where we talk about this week and we have to talk about 2 different months, but we're into May now. 1st of May, and this is the oldest of my dates this week. 1st of May, 1169. The Normans arrive, or the Normans stroke Norman English arrive in Ireland. And well, as I call it, the rest is history. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. The long and tortured relationship between England and Ireland starts this week, 1st of May, 1169. 1st of May, 1464. Edward IV marries Elizabeth Woodville. Obviously, Edward IV from the House of York, this is all in the times of the Wars of the Roses, marries Elizabeth Woodville, who was actually Elizabeth Woodville was already a widow. Her husband had been killed at the Second Battle of St. Albans, if I have my history absolutely correct. And Elizabeth Woodville was the mother of, obviously, the 2 princes in the Tower, Edward V and his brother, and also of just suddenly had an absolute brain freeze. Elizabeth of York, who was Henry VII's wife, or became Henry VII's wife, and of course Elizabeth of York she brought the white rose of York to the red rose sort of Henry Tudor, representing the Lancastrian cause, conveniently so. And that's how we got the Tudor rose, the 2 coloured rose, the red and the white. And of course, Elizabeth Woodville was the grandmother of Henry VIII. And indeed, she was at the birth of Henry VIII. So, interesting relationship. And of course, we'll come back to them maybe at another stage. 1st of May, 1851, the Great Exhibition opens in London. Probably it was almost like the trendsetter for World Expos, and we were there first. The Brits, very much driven by Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, housed in incredible glass exhibition hall called the Crystal Palace, and I'm going to definitely talk about the opening and the opening of and the Great Exhibition later on in today's show. Okay, so there we go. 2nd of May, 1497. John Cabot leaves Bristol, searching for North America. John Cabot, Italian explorer, seafarer, who had been commissioned by Henry VII. So funny how we just mentioned him with regard to Elizabeth of York, but commissioned by Henry VII to go and have a search out new lands in what's now North America. Becomes the first European since the Vikings to reach North America. I know Christopher Columbus had already got to the Americas, but don't forget Columbus made landfall in the Caribbean, and then had future expeditions into what's now Central America. But first European to go to North America, onto the North American continent, John Cabot. He actually set sail from Bristol on the 2nd of May, 1497, made landfall in, most people believe it's probably Newfoundland, but on the 24th of June. Although some people say it might have been in Cape Breton, but up in that sort of the maritime provinces of Canada. 1 or 2 people think it might have been in Maine as well, in the USA. But there you go. So John Cabot setting sail. He only had about 20 men on his ship, and it took them 6 weeks to get across the Atlantic. You forget sometimes just how small some of these ships were at this time. Those of you who've got the opportunity, if ever down in Brixham, in Devon, there is at Brixham, there's a replica of the Golden Hind and Francis Drake ship that he went around the world on. And It's piddly. It's piddly. There are little yachts next to it that are near as damn it the size of it. So incredible feats of seamanship and maritime skills in those days, and bravery, of course. Didn't really know where the hell they were going. So let me just have a quick look here. Tim Murphy is also giving a vote now for the Macedonian front. Thank you. Veronica, lovely to see you from Indonesia. I've just got a friend who's flown out there, arrived there yesterday, actually, in Jakarta. So there you go. Your hero, Oliver Reed, passed away drinking with the Navy on the 2nd of May, 1999. Well, I didn't know that. So thank you very much indeed, Charlie, for that one. Leslie, you're absolutely right about the Wars of the Roses. Something I'll talk about maybe at another stage. Actually, Wars of the Roses, fascinating bit of thing. But you're absolutely right. Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth Woodville, both grandmothers of Henry VIII. Right. Okay. So we're cracking on. So I always like to look at the comments. Sorry, folks, if I pause and I'm not quite as I am in my normal big videos each week. Right. So let's keep on the second of May. 2nd of May, 1611. The first published version of the King James Bible appears. So the King James Bible, obviously sanctioned by James I of England, and it probably the book that has given more phrases to the English language than any other. Obviously translations, but things like, My Brother's Keeper, there's a whole lot of them. There's absolutely incredible. When I did my talk about the Stuarts, I did a whole piece of work on this, and just incredible. All these phrases in the English language that we use nowadays. You don't have to be a churchgoer or indeed read the King James Bible, but the King James Bible is still in use in English churches. Very rare. And in fact, there was a moment, very rare, and it's like reading Shakespeare. Okay, it's very similar language. And I used to read in church back in Cheshire, and I used to practice at home with a modern Bible, and I knew that the church Bible was modern too. So as long as I knew roughly what I was going to go, I would then go up and find the place in the Bible, and I could read it reasonably proficiently. And I went up one day, and there'd been a wedding the previous day, and they'd insisted on the King James Bible, and someone had left it there. So I'd learnt this sort of, learnt the Bible passage in modern English, and I opened it up, and it was just like, oh my God, I've got to read it. And someone said, you were very good reading that old English. I wouldn't have been able to achieve it. And I thought, it was the hardest piece of, because normally, if you can't say a hard word in the Bible, you can get the gist of what's going on, and you can sort of make up a little bit. But in the King James Bible, we haven't got a clue. Anyway, that's a complete digression. Vicar of Dibley moment. It was Jen that managed to BS my way through it. But there you go. And actually, keeping North America, we just talked about John Cubbott setting sail from Bristol. 1670, 2nd of May 1670, the Hudson Bay Company is formed against its royal charter. And of course, the Hudson Bay Company was the main English instrument in sort of taking control in Canada, or at least representing British interests or English interests in Canada. And of course, you had the Hudson Bay. Well, you have Hudson Bay in Canada. That gave it the name of the Hudson Bay Company. But also one of its leading lights was Prince Rupert. Prince Rupert, who some of you will have come across in the English Civil Wars as the Charles I cavalry commander. He was actually Charles I's nephew. And Prince Rupert was one of the leading members of the Hudson Bay Company. And of course, for a while, a large part of northern Canada was called Prince Rupert's Land in his honor. So there you go. Now this one, back to Britain. And I mentioned Brixham in Devon just now. And of course, that's the Southwest Peninsula is a beautiful part of the world. And in fact, actually, if we just looking over here, that's there. That's obviously down in Cornwall for all my American and Canadian friends who maybe don't know England as well as some of the Brits here do. But a beautiful part of England, Devon, Cornwall, a little bit of Somerset and Dorset. But those of you who go down to Cornwall, especially if you go down the A38, so from Exeter down to Plymouth, crossing over the River Tamar, the traditional boundary between Cornwall and the rest of England. And Cornish people will tell you they ain't English, they're Cornish. And there's some history there, although quite a few of the folk living down in Cornwall nowadays are definitely English, not Cornish. But as you go across the Tamar, on the Tamar Bridge, you'll remember there's the big railway bridge next to you, sort of big arching bridge. That's called the Prince Albert Bridge. It was designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel, and it was opened on the 2nd. It was opened on the 2nd of May, 1859. Isambard Kingdom Brunel's Albert Bridge. It was opened by Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, who we've just mentioned with the Great Exhibition. So there you go, little one there when you're driving past. Anyone getting down to Cornwall this weekend or in the summer, you can say, do you know, that was around. It actually took them 5 years to build that bridge across the River Tamar. Cornish history, fascinating as well, generally. So there you go. 2 more dates I've got to share with you for the 2nd of May. 2nd of May's 1963. 2nd of May 1963. The Beatles, Please Please Me, tops the charts. In those days, there wasn't an official British chart, but it topped the chart in the NME magazine and also in Melody Maker. It became their first ever chart topper. It was their second record, and it topped the charts. Only came number 2 in the Record Retailers magazine, and the Record Retailers magazine ultimately became the official UK charts. And so consequently, in those charts, Please Please Me is not recognized as a number 1, but effectively it did top the charts in the charts that were being run by NME and Melody Maker. So there you go, the Beatles, 1963, 2nd of May. And May tends to be a traditional month for general elections in the United Kingdom. Not always, and of course, obviously, we have local elections in May, and we are seeing the results overnight from yesterday's local elections overnight and into today, aren't we? 2nd of May, 1997. This is the most recent of all the history dates here. Tony Blair leads Labour to victory in the 1997 general election, and on the 2nd of May, he is appointed Prime Minister by Queen Elizabeth II. So there you go. 3rd of May, 1926, but only just, okay? The only general strike in British history begins at 1 minute to midnight on the 3rd of May. So really, everyone came out on strike on the 4th of May, 1926. I'll give a little bit more to that in a while if people want it, okay? But we've got so the general strike starts at 1 minute to midnight on the 3rd of May, 1926. Last day, so that's today, isn't it? So there you go. But we have to wait till 1 minute to midnight to get a decent one in here for today. Let's look at tomorrow, Saturday, 4th of May, 1471, the Battle of Tewkesbury during the Wars of the Roses. A defining moment in the Wars of the Roses for the house, well, for both houses, for the House of York, victory for Edward IV, and defeat for the Lancastrians. And the Lancastrian king, Henry VI, was already imprisoned in the Tower of London, but his wife was helping lead the resistance, as it were, the Lancastrian cause. She's at the Battle of Tewkesbury. She's defeated, and her son, and Henry VI's son and heir, the Prince of Wales, is killed either in battle or executed sometime in the height of the battle. We're not quite sure. Buried in Tewkesbury Abbey. And I could talk a little bit more about that in a while if people want. The Battle of Tewkesbury. Great reenactment there later this year, and I'll share that date with you when it approaches. But for those of you who want to have a bit of medieval history and a bit of medieval battle reenactment, the Battle of Tewkesbury reenactment, really good to go to. Lovely town as well. 4th of May, 1780, the first running of the Derby, one of the gold standard events in British horse racing, in British flat horse racing. The Derby run on Epsom Downs, just in Surrey, just south of London. And I will touch on that one a little bit later. And last but not least, only because it's the most recent in the dates, and on the 4th of May, 4th of May, I said it was general election times, okay, and May's historically a general election time. 4th of May, 1979, Margaret Thatcher becomes the first female Prime Minister of Great Britain. And of course, since then, we've only had one other female prime minister in Theresa May. So there you go. So that's a gallop through the charts, as it were. Suitable nod to the Beatles, but that's a gallop through the events that happened this week in British history. A real mishmash, isn't there? So ones that I am happy to share with you, because I've done a little bit of work on, I'm going to talk a little bit about the first FA Cup final. I'm going to talk about the Normans arriving in Ireland. I'm going to talk about the Great Exhibition opening, and I am going to talk about that first running of the Derby. So, are there any other dates? Ones we can go into in a little bit more detail if people want. We could talk about the siege cut during the Mesopotamian campaign in the First World War. Could talk a little bit more about the man who never was. We could also talk about the general strike in 1926. Have we got any votes anyway, or are people just happy for me to rock and roll? What are people thinking? And let me, while you're all deciding what on earth you want me to talk about, let me just see what you've all been talking about in the comments. Wow, Edward Wheeler, thank you very much for sharing that one. That's a really cool one. Kerry Library, why 1 minute to midnight? I don't know, is the answer to that. Thank you, Jen. Jen and QA Library are on they think there's a similar thing. Thank you very much, David Cameron, for yours. Not the David Cameron, I'm guessing, but I suppose you are the David Cameron in your own life, aren't you? Kieran, you're absolutely right. We have had 3 female prime ministers. Yes. I blinked too quickly and forgot Liz Truss, didn't I? But you're right. We've had 3 female prime ministers. Slightly bizarre. They all come from one party. Amazing. Right. And David Cameron says in 1977, May, don't know what date in May, Liverpool lost the cup to Manchester United. I remember that FA Cup final. I do remember that one. John's just mentioned Liz Truss. Radio. Okie dokie, folks. So thank you very much, everyone. First off, just a couple of updates from what has been happening in the the life of Chris Green. We've had it's been a busy week. I don't know if any of you have been able to watch my Peter Butterworth video that I did, also a podcast. But Peter Butterworth from the Carry On films, not the only things he was ever in, but Peter Butterworth and his wartime service, which is fascinating to be in the prisoner of war camp where the Great Escape took place, and indeed where the Wooden Horse escape also took place. And he was involved on the periphery of both, which is fascinating story. No one knew until after he died, actually, and no one knew that he'd been in MI9 organizing escapes during the Second World War either. So I hope you've enjoyed that. If you haven't had a chance, it's going great guns, actually. And it's, as I say, been a busy week. And later today is another video. I have been on a bit of a roll. I've obviously been drinking something, and I've got one coming out later today for you. The life or the legend of Dick Turpin. So who was Dick Turpin? Who really was Dick Turpin? Probably Britain's, or if you're going to be parochial about it, England's most famous highwayman. And but why was he famous? Who the heck was he, and why was he famous? And that's what I'm going to go into in today's video. So I hope you enjoy that one as well. It's been fascinating researching it. I have to say, trying to find images for it was an absolute sod, because Dick Turpin fundamentally wasn't famous during his lifetime. So what you have is there are no life shots. There are no sitting for portraits like a lot of the Victorian generals that did. And there's a lot of pictures. He says it's fun and games been trying to find pictures that sort of bring the story to life. But I hope you enjoy it. So there you go. So what have we got here as well? Dick Turpin, actually, for those of you who are interested, I don't know if any of you have Apple TV, but on Apple TV at the moment is Noel Fielding, comedian, probably better known for the Great British Bake Off. is doing a spoof on Dick Turpin, and I've decided to watch it. And it's very funny. It's not Carry On, but it's got a similar sort of gentle humor to it, which is quite fun. I'm enjoying it. It's definitely not a documentary. He doesn't pretend it is. It is a send up of Dick Turpin. Well worth having a look at. Um, and in the talk today, we also happen to have a few nods to people like Horrible Histories, and Adam and the Ants as well. Do you remember that one? 1981. Not Prince Charming, Stand and Deliver. And Lordy, I remember thinking, Adam and the Ants, Adam Ant, he looked so scary and cool. And now you look at him, and he looks like a kid, which he probably was in 1981. But so it's funny how we all get a bit older, isn't it? But there you go. So, David, I totally agree with you. Funny enough, Sid James also gets a mention twice in the story of Dick Turpin, of course, because the Carry On mob did a film, Carry On Dick, and in fact, he might be in the thumbnail. I've got two thumbnails, and I'm trying to work out which one to use for that video later today. Okay, one's got Sid James. And one has got a traditional highwayman holding up a stagecoach. And I'm not sure. The Sid James one's quite funny. But on the other hand, it's not about Sid James and the Carry On team. And I wouldn't want people looking at the thumbnail and thinking it's another Carry On video from Chris. This is back into history, just not battles. Okay. So there we go. Right. Okay, folks, let me crack into the first of my stories for this week for you. Okay. And I'll come back to a couple of more things I'm going to talk about later on. So, the 28th of April, 1923, the very first FA Cup final at Wembley Stadium. Not the first ever FA Cup final. That had been in the 1870s, beginning of the 1870s. But this was the very first FA Cup final at Wembley Stadium. Those of you who watched last week's Roundup of British History will remember that Wembley Stadium was built as almost the centrepiece of the British Empire exhibition of 1924/25. And it was designed to be a sort of an all-inclusive sports venue. There'd be some football there. There was a running track. Rugby was held there during the great the 1924 Empire exhibition. And Wembley Stadium had been built very much to reflect the empire. So that's why it's got the twin towers were modelled on Mughal towers representing India in the British Empire. So it had only just been the Empire Stadium as the centrepiece for that exhibition was built early. So it was completed in 1923 for the exhibition, which is going to be in 1924. The stadium itself had only just been completed just a few days before the FA Cup final. They were up against it. The FA Cup final was going to be held there. And in classic, well, blimey, every big sporting event's like this, isn't it? Will the stadiums be ready on time? And it was like this then, back in 1923. So it was only just attended. King George V attended, the first ever monarch to attend an FA Cup final, because the FA Cup, it was a bit working class, wasn't it? Men with flat caps, and the king went to things like cows, yachting, and he went to it was things like the regattas, and definitely not at working class events like football. And King George V in 1923 came to the FA Cup final. They actually thought that the crowds would be quite small. Historically, they'd been big, but not massive. And the Empire Stadium had a capacity of 125,000, biggest stadium in England at the time, 125,000. The FA Cup final was actually between Bolton Wanderers of the old First Division, top division from Lancashire, and West Ham United from the Second Division of the day, second tier of English football. West Ham United from the East End of London, or the East of London. So thousands turned up for this final, the first ever one at Wembley Stadium. The turnstiles were rushed. People were getting in. In fact, so many people got onto the terracing, into the stands. They actually kept pushing, more and more coming in. I mean, it could have been like a blinking Hillsborough, except in those days there were no security fences, so you weren't actually penned in, which meant you could jump over onto the pitch, which is what people started to do more and more because more people were still arriving. They actually think in the 125,000 capacity, there was something like 240,000 people poured into Wembley Stadium to watch this FA Cup final, and it was the authorities were aghast. The whole of the pitch was covered in people. I mean, we had a major public order disaster about to happen any moment. You couldn't actually play a game of football because there was no playing surface left. It was full of men in flat caps, and so they they actually wondered whether it was going to get completely out of hand. There was going to be a potential riot. The Metropolitan Police were really concerned, and at that minute, just when everything was going completely bonkers, King George V appears in the royal box. I mean, it's just like, oh God, if you're a policeman, you'd also be thinking, oh bloody hell, could it have got any worse? And the crowd started singing the national anthem, and the King stayed there, and at the end of the national anthem, the police on horses started to try and move the crowd back, not charging, but basically using the police horses' bums to basically push people back off the playing surface so that the match could take place. Because actually, to try and remember in the days with no mobile phones, no tannoy systems, or decent tannoy systems, to try and actually evacuate 240,000 people out of the stadium and say actually the match has been abandoned, would be really hard to do. So the police, on quite a few mounted police, but one particular policeman was PC George Scory. Sorry, he was mounted on a white horse, and in all the photographs after the FA Cup final, his white horse stands out. All the black horses, because I mean it's black and white photos, wasn't it, folks? And lots of people in flat caps, and policemen in dark uniforms on dark horses. I mean, what a fantastic black and white photo that makes. And there was this one white horse standing in the middle by PC George Scory, backing people off the pitch. It became known, therefore, as the White Horse Final. Eventually, the field was cleared, and the game kicked off 46 minutes late. And the result was a 2-0 victory to Bolton Wanderers, who received the FA Cup from King George V, the first reigning monarch to attend an FA Cup final. So that's the first ever FA Cup final on the hallowed turf of Wembley, that had to be cleared by police horses because of a crowd. By the way, I just point out now, this wasn't a rioting crowd. Okay, this was just a crowd who they had nowhere else to go. They were standing on the pitch because they didn't know where else to go. We are not talking of like the famous England-Scotland internationals in the 1970s. Okay, so there we go, folks. I'm sure that's got one or two of you now talking about football. Kieran, that's fascinating. That Wembley was built on the site of a tower that was supposed to be built to rival the Eiffel Tower, Watkins Folly, but it never got past the first stage. Oh, there's a little video, isn't there? Right, okay, thank you for that one, Kieran. Was there any seating at Wembley at the time? I believe there was some seating, but not a lot, and principally it was terracing, so you could have sat on the terracing. But no, there was seating, but it wasn't an all-seater stadium, and didn't become that until back end of the 20th century. Sarah Jane, thank you for sharing that about having a football international program from First Football International at Wembley after World War II. Thinking about doing one coming up very soon, actually, about the very famous England International played in 1938 in Germany, in Berlin, where the England team were encouraged to give the Nazi salute as a bit of an part of the whole appeasement policy. Think about doing that story because it's a fascinating one, isn't it? Little bit of debate now about different leagues. Thank you very much. Jim, I'm glad you've been suitably enlightened. John, you found that quite moving. Oh, thank you. Not the way I told it, I'm sure, but I'd be interested, John, what you found moving about it, because other folk might um, as well. So if you feel you want to share why you felt it was moving, please do put it in. I think we're all sort of friends on here, aren't we? Um, David, yes, every football club in England is named after a place it hails from. Unlike Americans, English football teams traditionally do not move, or if they move, they don't move very far. Okay, so we don't have, we don't have Manchester United suddenly becoming Oxford United, or that's wrong terms. There is an Oxford, or where I live, Worcester United, or something like that. So slightly different to things like to like things like baseball in the US. Okay. Thank you for that. Just sorry, I'm going. Sometimes I go quiet because I actually have to read things. And QA Library, you always do a little missive for me, and I do try and concentrate. The guy from SETI Alpha V, the first Vulcan strike on the Falklands occurred this week during the Falklands War. Thank you very much for sharing that. And David Cameron says rugby traditionally played by upper class folks. You're talking rugby union, of course, not rugby league. But yeah, you're right. And of course, don't forget the initially football, organised football in England was played by private schools. Of course, rugby came out of someone picking up a football at a private school, rugby, and running with it. Yeah, and of course, the very early FA Cup finals were dominated by public school teams. But by the 1880s, it had become a working class and a professional sport in working class communities. But very initially, a very strong private school in the football as well. But you're absolutely right. Fundamentally, rugby union, upper class sport, football, working class sport, along with rugby league in the north of England. Invisible Ray, evening to you too. Good to see you. Thank you very much indeed. Right. And someone's just running. Got to mention May the 1st, 1994. Ayrton Senna died at the San Marino Grand Prix. I sort of remember it happening. I didn't have to be honest. Didn't realize it was as long ago as 1994. I didn't realize it was at San Marino. There is a story I heard that once he got stopped by police on the M1 in England after the after the British Grand Prix at Silverstone, and he got pulled over for speeding. And well, sometimes you wish you'd kept your mouth shut, because this policeman wandered over to him with the classic line, "And who do we think we are? Ayrton Senna." To which he said, "Well, yes." So there you go. It's up there alongside the record producer that refused to sign the Beatles because he reckoned bands with drums and guitars were on their way out. There you go. So let's move on to the next story I want to share with you. I want to go back in time to. Oh, by the way, this is a YouTube. Look at that, creator. I'm in the creator community of YouTube. Got that. That was a freebie when I went to my YouTube creator event in Birmingham just before Christmas, where I have to be honest, I was the oldest person there by a country mile. Funny, I've got a YouTube coach at the minute, and she's invited me down to the YouTube HQ in London. So I'll be going down there soon. So that'd be interesting, wouldn't it? I'll get you some photos, or maybe even do a live from there. Anyway, let's crack on. 1st of May, 1169, the Normans, or the Norman-led English army, arrives in Ireland. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sarah Jane. Normans arrive in London, in Ireland. About 90 Norman knights and something like 300 Welsh archers arrive in near Wexford and capture Wexford. They are under the command of a Anglo-Norman, called Robert Fitzstephen. So we're talking of just over 100 years after the Battle of Hastings and the Norman conquest of England. The English ruling class were still Norman. You might call it Anglo-Norman. Some of them married Anglo-Saxon women, principally widows from Hastings, but fundamentally it was still very Norman in its outlook. And this particular Norman knight, Robert Fitzstephen, rocks up near Wexford in Southern Ireland. And the question is, Why on earth did he rock up in Ireland? Well, I mean, the Normans were real. They were like locusts, if I'm honest. They if there was a potential to enrich themselves and have a fight, they were there. They'd already, of course, Sicily, the Crusades. There was quite a strong this little area of Normandy. And don't forget, the Normans themselves were descended from Vikings. So maybe there was that wanderlust and desire for material gain. Maybe was something quite inbred in Norman culture, but. The reason they were actually in Ireland was because Ireland at this time was not a united country. It was a geographic entity, obviously, but it wasn't a united country. There were a variety of kingdoms in Ireland, mainly Irish, native Irish kingdoms, Celtic Irish kingdoms, but there was also a Viking kingdom in Dublin. Dublin, a lot of people don't realize this, but Dublin historically was a Viking town. It was established by the Vikings as a trading centre, principally to trade Irish slaves. And what they were doing was they either went out on their own slaving missions, or indeed they would buy slaves from the various internal wars that were taking place in Ireland. Not dissimilar to what the British ended up doing in West Africa, actually. So we had the Viking kingdom in Leinster, but then we had the other Irish kingdoms as well. And it so happened that a man called Dermot MacMara, who had been the king of Leinster, had been deposed, and he wanted help to retake his kingdom. So Fitzstephen, he decided that the easiest people were these warlike Normans who are always on the lookout for a good fight. And he decided to basically get the Normans to come over. Fitzstephen was actually the vanguard of a bigger force. So he hadn't got a contract. Dermot MacMurrough hadn't got a contract with Fitzstephen. He had actually got a contract with Fitzstephen's boss back in England and South Wales, a man called Richard de Clare, also known as Strongbow. And de Clare was on his way, but the very first of the vanguard arrived under Robert Fitzstephen. And upon Fitzstephen's arrival, they attacked Wexford, captured Wexford, and then Richard de Clare, aka Strongbow, arrived with the rest of the troops. And now they assisted Dermot in regaining his throne. And he also took the Norse town or Norse kingdom of Dublin as well. Strongbow, de Clare, the Norman leader, actually married Dermot's daughter. And when Dermot died in 1171, 2 years later, Strongbow inherited his kingdom. And so now we had the Normans now had their little hands on a part of Ireland, which raised the concerns of the King of England, Henry II, first of the House of Plantagenet. Henry II had always had his eyes on Ireland as well. In fact, he had been given a papal bull by the Pope Adrian, who otherwise known the only English Pope, a bloke called Nicholas Breakspere, from Hertfordshire initially, spent most of his life actually in monasteries on the European continent. But he was the only English Pope there's ever been. Nicholas Breakspere, Adrian, I think it was Adrian IV, but maybe some Roman Catholics or Roman Catholic historians won't tell me otherwise here. But he'd received a papal bull. Papal bull was almost like it was almost like your golden ticket from heaven, which was basically he was sanctioned to conquer Ireland. And God would basically bless him. So it was like, back in medieval times, that was quite a powerful thing. Henry hadn't used it because actually, he had better things to do with his time than go on some mission to Ireland. Significant invasion to try and go from England to Ireland anyway. But now Henry saw that there was a potential rival Norman kingdom about to be established, Leinster. And don't forget, de Clare had land holdings in England and principally in South Wales. Okay, so the last thing he needed was basically a rival with his own lands and potentially more lands in Ireland. So Henry II called in and said, "Let's just remember who's boss and who you swear allegiance to, Mr. de Clare, Richard de Clare." And so Henry II arrives in Ireland with an army just to make sure that de Clare knows exactly what's going on. He might be called Strongbow, but he's not as strong as the King of England. He lands and secures the lands for himself rather than Strongbow. and sets up, and basically Henry II takes control of that foothold in Ireland. And that is, in a real nutshell, okay, the beginnings of English political and military influence in Ireland. Obviously, Ireland and England have been trading and stuff before that. There'd always been a relationship between them, but this is the first time the English had actually rocked up on Irish soil and taken over part of the country. And as they say, the rest is history. But fascinating. I will like to do some more stuff on Irish history in the past, because I think most Brits have not got a clue about Irish history over and above, quite frankly, the IRA. A little bit of Easter Rising, except it happened, and not much else. And it's been so instrumental. Oh, sorry, potato famine, I guess, as well for a lot of folks. And that's a bit of a travesty of Irish history, isn't it? And indeed the whole relationship as to why Irish people are in Britain, how many Irish officers, why were so many Irish officers involved in the British Victorian Army? Quite frankly, I don't think we'd have had half the empire if it hadn't been for Anglo-Irish officers. So I'd like to do that at some stage. So let me just have a look here. Waterford had also been a Viking settlement, Vassafjord. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you very much for that one, Kieran. Thank you. Is there a secret hand that keeps topping up my vodka? If only it was vodka. It's water, folks. But I have to say, if you're wondering what earth, plastic beaker, I've really got up market today. It's actually the Harbour Brewery in Tenby, which is a brilliant brewery. I was waxing lyrical about Cornwall, the other way. Oops, there, Cornwall earlier. But anyone who fancies another beautiful part of Britain, I really recommend Pembrokeshire on the southwest part of Wales. Beautiful. Tenby, fantastic. Great little town. Almost looks like something off the Amalfi coast. Although the painted, depends which direction, but it doesn't always look like that. But beautiful, walled town. And the Harbour Brewery in Tenby, absolutely cracking. So unfortunately, water here. It's early on a Friday yet, isn't it? But there you go. Thank you, John. And let's just have a look here. Where else we got? Well, we've got a lot of conversation going here. An invisible ray. All this time, it was the Pope's fault. Yeah, that's maybe we should do a little story on that one. Thank you very much. David, it's not even on the English education curriculum. That doesn't surprise me. There's a lot of stuff that isn't. I'm not going to bang on about that. I was laughing earlier about Captain James Cook arriving in Australia in 1770, and that's the beginning of British and European sort of history in Australia. When you think that we go right back into pre-Roman times, and that's just in England, and let's get Scotland in there and get Wales and Ireland. Actually, all of that is a heck of a lot to try and explore. And people like us love exploring it now, don't we? Whether we would like exploring it when we were 10 or 14, I'm not so sure. Some of the teachers might have been good and some of the teachers might have been bad. We might have had other things that we were doing at the time. We're all interested in history now, and you've sought out my channel. I seek out, books. It interests us. So, but yeah, thank you. Sorry, get off my soapbox now. Beg your pardon. And Leslie's came out with your classic line. There were as many Irish soldiers at Rorke's Drift as there were Welshmen. Yes, there were. And Heath, Pembrokeshire is where you live. Well, Heath, you live in a beautiful part of the world. Yeah, it's like Cornwall, but without all the tourists, isn't it? Glorious part of the world. So there you go. And Mike, the disabled Welshman, you're in Pontypool. Nice part of the world. Probably not quite as good as Tenby, but then I'm biased because I've got my cup. Heath, you're in Haverfordwest, not far from Fishguard, where of course the last invasion of Britain took place during the French Revolutionary Wars. But that's for another story, isn't it, folks? Can you do the South Sea missionaries in the 1830s? Some of them got eaten. Really? I didn't know that. Ooh. QA Library. You've got 3 microbreweries and a distillery in Portsmouth, maybe linked to a Royal Navy city. We also have the most tattoo shops in the UK. Great one. Thank you very much. Well, I'm looking forward to coming down to Portsmouth later this year at the end of July. I think I said I'd been invited to do a talk, actually, or invited to participate in a talk, deliver a talk in Portsmouth regarding D-Day on Saturday, the 8th of June. Don't get excited, QA Library, because I'm already booked. I've already got a gig with the Friends of the Mercian Regiment up in this part of the world. Couldn't believe it. I was really up for it. Checked my diary. They told me it was a D-Day talk. I thought, fantastic. I assumed it would be on the 6th of June or the 5th of June, maybe. Ends up being on the same blinking day. I'm already doing a talk up here in the Midlands. Lady luck, hey, sometimes. Righty-ho. So where are we at? Great Exhibition, 1st of May, 1851. Great Exhibition opened 1st of May, 1851. During this time, of course, this was probably actually the moment where Britain was at its very greatest, actually, economically rather than imperially. The empire really wasn't much of an empire at the beginning of the 1850s, apart from large parts of India and a reasonable chunk of eastern Canada. There really wasn't much more of the British Empire. Toeholds everywhere, a couple of forts along the West African coast, Cape Colony, very much, Cape Town, a bit of what was Port Elizabeth area, little bit of Natal colony, nothing in East Africa, no presence military or political in Egypt, Sudan, a little bit in Burma, we had Hong Kong. But definitely, the empire was sizable by European standards. It was one of the bigger empires at the time, but it was industrial, where Britain held its might. And it was known as the workshop of the world. And in 1851, this exhibition was put on to really show off her cultural and industrial prowess in the world, the Great Exhibition. It was housed in a huge glass house in Hyde Park in London. It was called the Crystal Palace. The Crystal Palace, I mean, it in itself sort of symbolized Britain's industrial prowess at the time. Glass and steel. It was 11 football pitches. We're talking, or my American friends, 11 soccer pitches. Okay, one building made of glass, glass and steel. So like the biggest greenhouse you've ever seen in your life, covering 11 football soccer pitches, designed by Thomas Caxton, in just over 5 months from the opening. Opened by Queen Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert. Well, he was playing second fiddle, rather like the Duke of Edinburgh used to for the Queen. He might be attending with her, but it was always the Queen who was actually opening it, and likewise Queen Victoria. But famous pictures there of the opening. But Prince Albert had been instrumental in the setting up of the Great Exhibition. It was one of his big pet projects. In many respects, very similar to the Duke of Edinburgh, not with his military experience and stuff, but just almost like a bright bloke who actually was feeling a bit like a loose part, as he wasn't the monarch, and he wasn't a joint monarch or anything like that. He was the Prince Consort. He wasn't even called a king. And so, yeah, he found projects to get involved in, a bit like Prince Philip did. And so this was one of them, the Crystal Palace. In just over 5 months while it was open, 6 million people, which is the equivalent to a third of Britain's population at the time, visited the Great Exhibition, which is incredible when you think about it. A third of the population visited the Great Exhibition in London. This thing, over 800,000 visitors. Spent a penny. There was flushing toilets were put in the Great Exhibition, and it was great. These flushing toilets, most people didn't know about flushing toilets. Okay, and most people didn't have flushing toilets. Most people hadn't seen a flushing toilet. Contrary to popular opinion, not by Thomas Crapper, who came on later. This was by a bloke called Jennings, Richard Jennings, I think his name was. But and I think he was from Portsmouth, if I'm not mistaken. QA Library, you might tell me otherwise. But Jennings put this exhibit in of flushing toilets to show Britain's, again, social industrial prowess. With a twist, you could use the exhibit, and it would cost you a penny. And 800,000 people spent a penny going to the toilet. And for those Brits, you will know that spending a penny is still the phrase, the euphemism for going to the toilet. And that's where it started, with Jennings and his flushing toilets at the Great Exhibition in 1851. Interestingly, another euphemism has come around. His flushing toilet designs were then later improved by a man called Thomas Crapper. Thomas Crapper actually put flushing toilets in Sandringham, which had been bought by the future Edward VII. So he sort of got royal approval for his. And of course, yes, slightly better, slightly less genteel than going to spend a penny. We can also go for a crap, can't we? And that's where it comes from, folks. So the Great Exhibition of 1851, unlike the British Empire exhibition, which I talked to you about last week in 1924, the Great Exhibition of 1851 was a massive commercial success, hugely profitable. In fact, actually, the profits, they made so much money from the Great Exhibition, not just from the people spending a penny, I hasten to add, they made such big profits that they needed to spend them. And basically, the profits were pumped into establishing 3 museums nearby to Hyde Park. They were in Kensington. They were the Science Museum, the Natural History Museum, and the Victoria and Albert Museum. They were initially funded by the proceeds, the profits from the Great Exhibition of 1851. And indeed, between them all, they now have something like 12 million visitors a year. So it's pretty impressive. Eventually, the Crystal Palace itself was dismantled and moved to South London, to Sydenham, where it famously burnt down in the 1930s. And only there are a few foundations of it still remain in Sydenham. Of course, it gave its lasting legacy was it gave its name to the park nearby, gave its name to Crystal Palace, and Crystal Palace, both the sports venue and Crystal Palace Football Club. So there we go. So let me just have a look over here, because I knew it. I knew it. Spending a penny and the crappers. I knew I was left. It's just like a gift, isn't it? That I am the gift that keeps giving. So George Jennings, according to QA Library, not the best source. He says, because it's using Wikipedia. No, Wikipedia is not always the best source, I grant you. I throw some money in every now to Wikipedia. They ask for donations, and I always think, well, they're a good source. One of the things I do love about them, I use Britannica a lot, actually. But one of the things that's lovely about Wikipedia is there are so many cross-references you can do, and you can go down lots of rabbit holes. Britannica's not quite as good as that, for that, should I say. But there you go. So where are we at? We're at the top of the hour. So let me give you one last one for today, folks. Okay. We've got the 4th of May, 1780, the first running of the Derby. So this race is for 3-year-old colts and fillies. Run over a mile at Epsom Downs. It's now been extended. It's now 1.5 miles at Epsom Downs in Surrey. One of the key features of the British horse racing calendar of the flat season. First run, 4th of May, 1780. It was established by 2 men. The steward of the Jockey Club, Sir Charles Bunbury, and one of the leading horse racing magnates at the time, also a leading member of the Jockey Club, the 12th Earl of Derby. And they decided that they would have Derby had already held a race called the Oaks, which named after the house where it was, where it had been, where they'd had the idea. But now he had this idea that they would have a race for 3-year-old fillies and colts, and he and Bunbury, Sir Charles Bunbury, decided to toss a coin to see whose name would the race would be named after, and Derby, the Earl of Derby, won. And that's why it's called the Derby. Interestingly, there is a Bunbury Stakes at the Derby race meeting. And just to gain revenge, actually, in that very first race meeting, named after the Earl of Derby, the 12th Earl of Derby. And by the way, just before that, Earls of Derby, fascinating mob. They own Knowsley Hall up near Liverpool. Very involved with Lancashire, Liverpool area, bits of Cheshire. The Earls of Derby started with as the Stanley family. They're now called the Smith Stanleys, and certainly Edward Smith Stanley was the 12th Earl of Derby that we're talking about now. The Stanleys, if you know your Wars of the Roses history, the Stanleys famously stood aside at the Battle of Bosworth and didn't help Richard III. And in fact, actually, eventually one of the Stanley brothers came in on the side of Henry Tudor at a crucial moment when Richard III was about to break through and actually probably annihilate Henry Tudor on the field. And suddenly he got hit in the side by a cavalry charge by the Stanley family. So the Stanleys have a long history. The other brother, Stanley at the time, was married to Margaret Beaufort. Obviously, she'd previously been married to a Tudor, Edmund Tudor, who was Henry VII's father. He had died of the plague, early part of the Wars of the Roses, and she'd end up marrying Thomas Stanley. So the Stanley family were rewarded, made Earls of Derby, and the Derby family have significant interests. We had a Lord Derby who was a Victorian Prime Minister, three-time Victorian Prime Minister, never lasted more than 18 months in any of those times. And of course, one of the later on, the great-great-grandson, Lord Derby, was the man who famously recruited over 1,500 men in 2 days at the beginning of World War I in Liverpool, the Liverpool Pals battalions. He was absolutely instrumental in establishing those Liverpool Pals battalions. But anyway, back to 1780, the 12th Earl of Derby, and so Edward Smith Stanley. It's named after him. The first race of the Derby race, Sir Charles Bunbury got his revenge. His horse beat the Earl of Derby's horse. So whilst it's not called the Bunbury race meeting, he at least won the very first Derby. So there you go. His horse was called Diomed. He also Sir Charles Bunbury went on to win 2 more Derbies with other horses as well. So there you go. That is the Derby race, or the beginning of the Derby race back in 1718. Speaking of horses, look out for this afternoon's video when I get it out. Where are we? Just gone 2 o'clock. It'll come out later, probably maybe 4 o'clock-ish, about Dick Turpin on his famous horse Black Bess. Or maybe that was just all made up, wasn't it? Not Dick Turpin himself, but the ride to York was not what Dick Turpin did. But I'll tell you all of that in today's video, all about the real Dick Turpin. What was he about? And why did he become so famous? So in the meantime, have a look at the Peter Butterworth. Just to finally say to you that I will just share with you that 2 books I've been reading recently. I've been read The Four Feathers, the original Four Feathers, the book, not the films. And you can guess where that might be leading to with a video production in the future. But yeah, so I wanted to get my head around, because I was thinking about how close are the Four Feathers, the various Four Feathers films, to what happened with the British fighting the Mahdists in Sudan. And then I thought, actually, why don't I read the book and find out where it really started? And interesting, the book is actually quite close to a lot of events that were happening in Sudan prior to sort of around back end of Gordon and a little bit on prior to Kitchener's invasion of Sudan. But and the films deviate quite significantly from the book, let alone from history. So, but I think I'd like to share that one with you. Finished that a couple of weeks ago. But what I finished this morning, in fact, was The Man Who Would Be King by Rudyard Kipling, because several of you have talked about that one as well and said, you know, is there any truth in the film, The Man Who Would Be King? Is it really based on historical fact? And the answer is not really, no. But it is a book by Rudyard Kipling, story by Rudyard Kipling, and fascinating. Of course, the film starred Sean Connery and Michael Caine. What a great lineup, eh? And actually, do you know the film doesn't vary massively from the book, but there is one major deviation. But I'm going to share that with you maybe when I do a story about it. Not sure if I will, because it's not actually based on a historic event, bar the fact that there are tribes similar to the people in Kafiristan, as it was called in the book, in on the sort of the borders of Afghanistan, Pakistan. But yeah, uh, but nothing actually based upon the two men who would be king. But there you go. Thank you, everyone, for joining me today. Look out for Dick Turpin. If you haven't watched it, have a look at Peter Butterworth in the meantime. Oh, and by the way, members, I will be putting a video out, members-only video out. Probably it's going to be, well, it'd be a live talk, actually. Week on Monday, 13th of May, in the evening, do a live talk all about General Gillespie. Do you remember him from the Gurkha War, the Nepalese War? A man who lived an incredible life, shipwrecked, smallpox, shot at in Haiti by the French, attacking eight people who were burgling his house in what's now the Dominican Republic, fighting them off single-handed with a sword, killing 6 of them. I thought I'd share his story because it's a bit bonkers, including, of course, his dramatic end in the Gurkha War. That will be a live, especially for members. It will get recorded, so if you can't join me live, then you can obviously watch it. But it will be live, a bit like this. You can join in with the chat. But that will be a members only. So sorry, folks, if you're not a member, you can't get it. Obviously, you know how you can. But thanks for everyone for joining me today. Thank you for all your support. Have a lovely weekend. It's a bank holiday weekend, a holiday weekend here in the UK. So I hope, well, I'm not sure the weather's going to shine too much, but on Sunday, I'm off to Cheltenham for the Cheltenham Jazz Festival. Tickets to see Courtney Pine. Got to be honest, Jazz Festival. I'm not sure if I can sit through an hour of jazz. I'll either be a convert, won't I, or I'll never want to do it again. In the meantime, folks, have a great weekend, whatever you're doing. For those of you, John in particular, have a beer on me. Enjoy yourselves. Keep well. More videos coming next week.